The connection that companies don't make is that if you have a company full of people who care deeply, you're going to drive the business. You're going to drive revenue. You're going to drive innovation. You're going to drive growth. And if you had anything else in your business, a sales strategy, an engineering strategy that drove revenue and drove growth, what would you do? You'd invest more in it. That's right. So all we're doing with culture is recognizing that it is a strategy that drives efficiency and innovation and growth. And so we're investing more in it. And if we do that with an intentional mindset, if we take pains to say, hey, this is our language around culture, this is how we talk about our culture, this is how we describe what our values mean. If we take the time to do that, we're implementing a business strategy.
Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning into another episode of the Bricks Bytes podcast. On this episode, we welcome Steve Zahm, Chief Culture Officer at Procore. Steve speaks to us about the role of the Chief Culture Officer at Procore and his insights into the culture of organization. We also discuss how the industry changed within the last 20 years since the early days of Procore, importance of the culture in the organization, implementation of the culture within the organization, and of course, many, many more. If you're enjoying our podcast, please hit the subscribe button. Steve, so almost 2 decades in Procore. How has the industry changed in the last 20 or so years?
Oh my gosh. The construction industry, when I first started working on Procore, which was in 2004. So our CEO and founder, Tui Kordemensch, founded Procore in 2002. And Tui and I met because we both had kids in the same preschool. So those kids have grown up, moved out of the house, and have their own careers now. That's how long I've been doing this. Wow. So when I talk about the changes in construction, you're literally talking about the changes over a lifetime. And what we saw, what attracted me to Procore in the very early years was we would go and demo early versions of the product, which, by the way, only ran on a laptop computer or a desktop computer. It was only available via Wi-Fi at a construction job site. Yet we would go and demo Procore's limited functionality at that time to some very experienced and more senior, shall we say, members of the construction industry, construction company owners in their 70s. And I had a gentleman after a demo. I thought we were going to be booted out onto the street with our laptop and our demo. And he said, I'm not sure about how I would use this, but I know that this is the future of the construction industry. And so that is really what kept us going during the early years, was really about listening to the customer and saying, what needs can we solve for the construction industry? Mm-hmm. And we encountered our share of detractors, of people who weren't believers, of people who said, what, do you really think that my superintendent is going to show up on a job site with a tablet computer? Which makes me laugh so much, because if you've ever been on a job site in the last few years, or really in the last decade, of course, every superintendent shows up with a ruggedized tablet computer hanging off of their back. That's how they get the information that they need to do their job and to build the project. So that's the evolution of the industry. If you give the construction industry the right tools, if you give them what they need to get the job done, they will use that tool. Now, the difference is that prior to really the emergence of tablets, of smartphones, of connectivity, of acceptance of keeping data in the cloud, prior to that, the right tools really didn't exist. What they were more logging tools. So how do we record what happened on the job? Instead of communication and collaboration, what you had was record keeping. That's been a huge shift for Procore. And so now we're moving from the stage of communication and collaboration to how do I do my job better? So what should I do next? And that's where you saw some of Procore's announcements at this conference around the use of, for example, artificial intelligence and what we're calling Procore Copilot, and how that is not only going to inform people about facts on the job as they are, but also what should they do moving forward? What is the next best action? I think that's a complete evolution when you look at construction technology and the construction industry's acceptance of not only are we going to log what happened, but we're going to know what's happening and we're going to get help with what should happen.
I'm just very curious of the early visions of Procore. What was it meant to be this 20 years ago?
20 years ago.
You knew about AI Copilot coming in 2023, 2024, right?
No, we had no idea. I think that I was coming off of starting a company in another space and taking that company public up in Silicon Valley and doing the whole kind of typical tech thing. And one thing I knew for sure at that point was that I would never do a bigger experience than grow a company to 400 employees and over $50 million in revenue. Well, that was absolutely 100% wrong. We had no idea that the need within the construction industry was so acute that the construction industry was going to adopt the tool when the tool became valuable, to the extent that now we have this mission to connect everyone in construction on a global platform. And Procore truly is a global company with over 4,000 employees all around the world. That vision wasn't there 20 years ago. But the commonality to that vision was about communication and collaboration, getting people to work together better on that job site so that they had the information they needed to do the job that needed to be done when they needed that information. That part of the vision hasn't changed at all. Things like AI and Procore Copilot, completely new.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously your role now as a chief culture officer, in the early days, that's probably much a dream for, or at least early stage startups, to have someone in that position. So what does the chief culture officer do?
Well, it's interesting. I chose the title of chief culture officer. I think I should say at first, I've done almost every job at Procore on the business side, not on the product side. Don't let me near the product design or anything like that. But I've done almost every job at Procore as we grew. And thank goodness I'm not in charge of finances anymore. That's another one. But even since we've been public, I've been Procore's acting CIO. I've been Procore's acting CHRO. And those were all roles that helped me learn about the importance of people at the business. At the end of the day, the technology is amazing, but if that technology doesn't have the best people using it, then we're in big trouble. So I very intentionally, when I had the opportunity to kind of step back and have Tui say, look, what would you like to do next? And I want to continue to drive value at Procore. And to me, that really meant, how do we elevate this conversation around the importance of culture as a strategic advantage to the business? And one way I could do that was by taking on a chief culture officer title and inviting those conversations. So why the heck is one of the earliest guys at the company so focused on culture? Well, when I say that, when I hear that from our clients or our prospects, I say, I am so glad you asked that because we really do see a difference here. We see a difference, and we joke about it with our orientation classes. We hire every couple of weeks. We have 30 to 50 new employees joining Procore. And when I ask them, I say, how many of you 6 months ago, when you were starting your job search, how many of you said, boy, I hope I really get to go to work for a construction software company? Not a lot of hands go up. But at the same time, if I ask them, how many of you started that job search because you want to work at a great place to work? Every hand goes up. So if we can be intentional about our culture and say, if we can have the ability to communicate why Procore's culture makes the company a great place to work at, not only are we a market leader, but we're a market leader where it's fun to do the job. If we can do that, we can attract the best people. If we can attract the best people, we can win whenever we have a challenge. So that's why we like to focus on that.
Okay, and me and Martin were just chatting. Like, you have done I genuinely mean this, like, seriously good job. Like, everyone we speak to at Procore is so passionate. It's so refreshing to see because it's obviously a cultural thing. But in the UK, I feel like we don't necessarily get that kind of passion and drive for their projects, so for their job. So what's the secret sauce?
There's really no secret. If you think about it, if you look and you pull back and you look at a worldwide level, there's this whole issue of how much do employees care about their jobs. And I think it's fascinating. The Gallup organization, who does the Gallup polls, they're very famous for collecting different data about conditions in the workforce. And they do an engagement survey around the world. And every year, the stats come back to be about the same thing, that if you look at the worldwide employee workforce, there's about 20 to 25% of employees who are positively engaged with their jobs. There's about 60% who are neutrally engaged and the remainder are negatively engaged. Mm-hmm. So if you think about what that means, it means that for the majority of societies around the globe, it is unusual to be excited about your job. Mm-hmm. So if I can just get the company to the point where our employees are more often than not excited about their jobs, I have an immediate strategic advantage over any of my competitors because they're probably settling for normal. And normal is neutral, not caring or caring kind of ambivalent about the entire thing. But if I can create a culture, a positive culture that drives that positive engagement, then almost by definition, those employees are going to be better at their jobs. However you measure better, you could talk about creativity, you could talk about cost effectiveness, you could talk about customer satisfaction, you could talk about just driving revenue. They're going to be better if they care about it. Give me any employee who cares deeply about their job versus an employee who doesn't really care all that much, and the one who cares is going to do a better job. Well, the connection that companies don't make is that if you have a company full of people who care deeply, you're going to drive the business. You're going to drive revenue. You're going to drive innovation. You're going to drive growth. And if you had anything else in your business, a sales strategy, an engineering strategy that drove revenue and drove growth, what would you do? You'd invest more in it.
That's right.
So all we're doing with culture is recognizing that it is a strategy that drives efficiency and innovation and growth. And so we're investing more in it. And if we do that with an intentional mindset, if we take pains to say, hey, this is our language around culture, this is how we talk about our culture, this is how we describe what our values mean. If we take the time to do that, we're implementing a business strategy.
So within the whole wide range of experiences on different positions within Procore, are there any key lessons you learned while driving the culture within the organization?
Yes, I think that as we grew, when we started out, for example, and we came up with our values of openness, ownership, and optimism, we were about a 40-person company, all in 2 rooms in Santa Barbara, California. We could see each other, and we were largely, the workforce was comprised of recent college graduates because that's who we could afford to hire at that point. But we really knew what those terms meant because the demographic was pretty much common. The age was pretty much common. We could see each other in the same room working. You could absorb the behavior through osmosis. But as we grew as a company, as we became first across the US and then around the world, all of a sudden you have people of all sorts of different ages and professional backgrounds, and they're all coming together. And those terms of openness, ownership, and optimism, they didn't have any language behind that. Mm-hmm. We needed to expand our cultural language. So we needed to come up with a model that said, hey, here's what we mean. And we implemented a whole nother set of language, which at first, as a startup founder, I wanted to stay nimble. I wanted to stay light. I didn't want to be too prescriptive. But I needed to give people the glossary of terms to work with. And that's where we went to work on this language of our culture, which includes everything from the values to a tagline. So for ownership, for example, there's a tagline. It's take initiative and move forward. So what are we trying to get at? Well, I want something that's short, that you can memorize, and at least gives you a signpost to what do we mean by ownership? We mean that if you own something, you're not supposed to hold it close to your vest and not letting anyone else take it from you. Instead, we're saying you own the initiative to make things better. Take initiative and move forward. In other words, do something. And then the next level down, we came up with a series of, for every value, there's kind of what I call guardrails. We must or we must not. And short, memorable phrases that kind of say, what do we mean? What do I do next? Well, one of the we must nots for ownership is we must not get in over our heads and not ask for help. Well, that means that if you've taken ownership of a project and you're kind of drowning in that work and you're having trouble because you don't have the resources, we're encouraging you to raise your hand and say, hey, I need help here, because as a company, what would I rather have? Would I rather have someone who stays quiet because they don't want to be criticized for not performing or not bringing that project to success? Or would I want the benefit of whatever that project was? Obviously, I want the benefit. I want them to ask for help. But I need to give them the language to talk about that, to ask about it. So as we've grown, learning that we have to expand the language so that more employees all around the world understand what the heck we mean by ownership has been one of the key learnings for us.
So in practice then, how do you implement that? Because, you hear funny stories, it's sprayed up in the wall and the glass partition in the meeting room or whatever. But obviously, I'm guessing, or maybe through a bit of experience, it has to come from the top down.
It has to, always.
And so how does that practically work?
Well, it goes back again to the use of the language. And it's something that if your leaders don't buy into your values, if they don't buy into your mission statement or your vision statement or your values, if they roll their eyes when they talk about them, then you're in big trouble. So first thing, I can't tell other companies what their values or mission statement or vision statement should be. I have no idea, but make sure that your leaders believe in it, that they really take it to heart, that they believe down to the core of their being that this is what the company should do. And the reason for that is because every single one of your leaders has to be what I call a CRO, or Chief Repeating Officer. And if there's one thing that leaders don't like to do, it's say the same thing over and over again. But you need to get your leaders speaking this language because it has to be coming from the top. And not only that, but it has to be lived. It has to be authentic. And if they're not, after you've named your culture and you've built the teams, you need to live that culture. And that authenticity comes from using the language when you're talking about recognition, when you're talking about hiring decisions, and even when you're talking about firing decisions. If you say to somebody from a leadership level, especially when you have to terminate another leader in the organization for not adhering to your values, you're sending an incredibly strong message to the rest of the organization that our culture matters even more than individual excellence in terms of the business performance.
Yeah.
And what would be ways to measure culture within the organization?
Yeah, I think where we've had a lot of success is we do semi-annual, what we call an employee voice survey. It's basically an engagement survey. Now, does the engagement survey, once you get the score back, this is what percentage of employees are positively engaged, is that mission accomplished? By no means. What that is, it's a tool that allows you to see where in the organization are the hotspots, who's doing well, who's not doing well. And there's so many ways to slice this. You can do it by department, you can do it by team, you can do it by which part of the world are they working in, you can do it by age, you can do it by gender or other demographic, you can do it by tenure. But it starts to surface these issues so that then you can focus your efforts, because what gets the focus is what gets solved as a problem. And then you want to go out and dig deeper and say, how do we really put into place some actual tactics that can solve for some of the issues that were surfaced by the engagement survey? So don't just survey and sit back and say, oh, we're better than last year. Great, next. You actually have to do something to it, or do something with that data. And not only that, but you have to communicate back to the employees, we are doing this because this is what we discovered by listening to you. So if you give your employees a voice and then go back and tie your actions to what you learned from that survey, then that starts to build this culture of, hey, we can improve things. We can make things better here, that my voice is heard.
Steve, so Procore is a construction tech company and you sell software to construction businesses. Is there any difference in culture between software developers designing products and software and the target audience of people working on construction sites? And if there is any gap between the cultures here, how do you bridge it?
Sure, there's a big difference between a software engineer and between someone who's out on a construction site every day. But I think what's so important is that when we talk about the people who come to work for Procore, with, call it 85%, having no experience in the construction industry whatsoever.
85, you said?
About 85 have no construction experience other than the type of experience that I have, which is when you mess up a bathroom remodel and your spouse doesn't let you do that anymore. So really what we try and do is we have a whole construction education department that, starting at orientation and going through someone's tenure at Procore, seeks to really educate every Procore employee, whether or not they're customer facing, whether or not they're in the field, about how construction works. And the reason for that is if you don't understand how construction works, how do you appreciate the value that Procore's products bring to our users? And if you don't appreciate the value of what our products do for our users, how do you get excited and find purpose in your actual work? So you're all here at Groundbreak, and it's obviously a user conference, but I like to tell people that Groundbreak is an employee event disguised as a user conference. And the reason I say that is because every Procore employee that comes to Groundbreak goes back to work next Monday more excited, more engaged, and more invigorated than when they showed up here. If I had the budget and I was in charge of how many people get to come to Groundbreak, every single Procore employee, hopefully the earlier the better in their tenure at Procore, would come and work at Groundbreak in order to have that face-to-face contact. Since we can't do that, we try other methods such as job site visits. So we take every employee that wants to go and do a job site visit with a client and see the Procore software being used. We enable those kind of programs. So building that bridge between whatever it is your company does and every employee at your company, that's the only way that they're going to get a passion for the job that they do and be highly engaged as part of your employee workforce.
Cool.
Brilliant.
All right. Steve, any final closing statement on culture generally before we wrap this up?
I would go back to that Gallup's stat about only 20 to 25% of employees being positively engaged. And I would ask of all the listeners to your show, how can you drive all of your employees to that positive engagement? Of course, some are going to be crazy excited about your business and others are going to be less so. But if everyone can be positively engaged, if they can be in the minority of the worldwide workforce on that, you're making the world a better place. Think about how that affects their families, their communities, and their mental health, and their ability to provide great work for whatever it is your company does. That would be my ask.
Love it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.